Was there a future African king enslaved in Mexico? Imagine African royalty escaping slavery, leading a rebellion in Mexico, and not just surviving, but building a town that still stands today. What if I told you this story unfolded 2 years before the Pilgrims even landed at Plymouth Rock? Today we'll uncover the story of Gaspar Yanga, a man whose legacy defied the might of the Spanish Empire and still echoes through the streets of a small town in Veracruz, Mexico. Friend, welcome to another episode of the Mysteries of Latin America. I'm Andrew, and if you're new here, what we do is dive deep into the myths, legends, history, and unsolved mysteries that span the vast and vibrant lands of Latin America, from the northern border of Mexico to the southern tip of Argentina and across the Caribbean islands. Whether you have roots in this region or are simply curious about the stories hidden beneath the surface, you're in for something today. Now, friends, I'm going to ask you to bear with me for a second because I've had a cold and a throat thing for the last couple of weeks, but sometimes there are stories that just have to be told, and this is one of them. And today's episode is about the little-known story of Gaspar Yanga, a man whose defiance in the face of oppression laid the groundwork for Mexico's first free town and became a symbol of resistance against Spanish colonial rule. So let's take it back to the 1570s. In Veracruz, Mexico, the sugar plantations are booming. But beneath this wealth lies the harsh reality of the system that fuels it: slavery. Enslaved Africans, forced to work long hours under brutal conditions, powered these plantations. Among them was a man named Gaspar Yanga, or Nyanga. His real name is lost to history, though many believe he hailed from the Bran people of what is now Gabon in Central Africa on the Atlantic coast. But Yanga wasn't just any enslaved man. He claimed royal descent and had been destined to become a king in his homeland. But here on the plantations of New Spain, that lineage was insignificant, and he was a slave like any other African. Despite the conditions, Yanga carried with him the dignity and resolve of his royal ancestry. To him, the idea of living out his days in bondage was intolerable. So one day he made a conscious decision to escape or die trying. In the early 1580s, Yanga and a small group of trusted followers made their escape. They fled into the rugged mountains of Veracruz, choosing freedom over chains. It was a bold move, and the risk was immense. Escaping slavery wasn't about just running away. Yanga and his followers had to navigate unfamiliar terrain while avoiding capture by Spanish authorities and bounty hunters at every turn. But Yanga wasn't just running to survive. He was running to build something more profound, a community. Along with his fellow escapees, many of whom were also from West and Central Africa, Yanga founded a secret settlement, a palenque. This palenque was more than just a refuge. It was a new beginning for people who refused to live as slaves. The term palenque, derived from the Spanish word for fenced-in area, came to describe settlements built by escaped slaves. You also might have heard the term maroons in other part of the Americas to describe escaped slaves. Well, that's what Yanga and his people were, cimarrones, maroons in English, living freely and defiantly. Over time, Yanga's palenque grew. What began as a small group of fugitives soon transformed into a thriving community. They farmed the land, established trade with local indigenous groups, and developed their own system of laws and governance. Yanga's settlement wasn't just a hiding place. It was a fully functioning society that embraced the principles of freedom, equality, and self-reliance. But all was not peaceful. Living in the mountains meant constant vigilance, as the Spanish were well aware of Yanga's growing influence. His people became experts in guerrilla warfare, mastering the rugged terrain that surrounded them. They used the thick jungle and mountains to their advantage, launching raids on Spanish caravans to gather resources and send a clear message: we are free and we will stay free. By 1609, Yanga's settlement had become too powerful to ignore. Spanish colonial authorities were alarmed, and rightly so. Yanga's success not only threatened the economic interest of the region, but also inspired other enslaved people to start thinking of freedom. The palenque became a symbol of defiance against the Spanish Empire, and Yanga himself became a dangerous figure in the eyes of the colonial rulers. The Spanish crown knew they had to act. To them, Yanga wasn't just a runaway. He was a direct threat to their control over New Spain. And so, in 1609, they launched a massive expedition with the goal of crushing Yanga's rebellion once and for all. The Spanish sent 500 heavily armed soldiers under the command of Pedro González de Herrera, a seasoned military leader. Their mission: destroy Yanga's settlement and bring its people back into bondage. The Spanish soldiers, confident in their numbers and firepower, marched into the mountains. But they were walking straight into a trap. Yanga had spent years preparing for this moment. He and his people knew the terrain better than anyone, and his forces had perfected their guerrilla tactics. As the Spanish advanced, Yanga's people ambushed them from hidden positions, striking swiftly before melting back into the dense jungle. One of the most famous battles was the Battle of Cerro del Gallo, and it was a brutal, drawn-out conflict that lasted weeks. Yanga's forces, armed with stolen muskets, machetes, and bows, used the landscape to their advantage, hitting the Spanish crown under the cover of darkness. The Spanish soldiers, weighed down by their armor and unfamiliar with the rugged terrain, were frustrated and disoriented. The fight wasn't going as they had planned. As the battle dragged on, the Spanish began to suffer heavy casualties. They were running low on supplies and morale. The costs of this expedition were becoming greater than anticipated, and a decisive victory seemed further and further out of reach. And then something unexpected happened. The Spanish offered Yanga a deal. Rather than continue the costly battle, they proposed a truce. In exchange for peace, Yanga's people would be granted their freedom and allowed to settle on a designated plot of land where they could live autonomously. But would Yanga take the deal? Could he trust the Spaniards? Yanga took the deal in the name of his people. For Yanga, this was a strategic decision. After years of fighting, he knew that further conflict would lead to the total destruction of his community. Instead, Yanga chose a path that would secure the future of his people. So, in 1618, the Spanish officially recognized the settlement of San Lorenzo de los Negros, the first free town in all of the Americas, predating even the founding of what would become the United States by years and years. Yanga passed away in 1620, just 2 years after securing his community's freedom. But the town he founded continued on, at least for a time. Initially, the peace agreement allowed the community to thrive, and for about 30 years, San Lorenzo de los Negros enjoyed relative independence. However, the peace was fragile. The Spanish authorities, though they had recognized Yanga's town, never fully accepted its autonomy. The colonial government saw the settlement as a continued threat, a reminder that rebellion could succeed. Over the time, Spanish officials began to encroach on the town's independence, subjecting its people to harassment and punitive expeditions. They pressured the community to assimilate into broader colonial society, gradually eroding the freedom Yanga had fought so hard to secure. By the late 17th century, much of the town's original self-rule had been lost. The residents of San Lorenzo de los Negros were forced to integrate into the Spanish colonial system. And while the town survived and was eventually named Yanga in his honor, the vision of a fully independent, self-governing community had faded. But still, the legacy of Yanga's resistance continued to inspire future generations of Afro-Mexicans and other oppressed groups throughout Latin America. Today, Yanga, Veracruz is home to about 20,000 people, and a good number are descendants of the original settlers. Every year, the town celebrates the Fiesta de San Lorenzo, a vibrant festival that honors Yanga's legacy and blends Afro-Mexican, indigenous, and Spanish traditions. But despite the local celebrations, Yanga's story remains largely unknown outside of Veracruz. The history of Afro-Mexicans, like Yanga's descendants, has long been marginalized in Mexico, often excluded from the national narrative. It wasn't until the 2020 census that Afro-Mexicans were even officially recognized by the Mexican government, revealing a population of nearly 2.5 million people. Many Afro-Mexicans continue to face systemic racism, social and economic inequalities, and limited political representation. But there is hope. There's a growing movement to bring the contributions of Afro-Mexicans into the spotlight, recognizing their important role in shaping the country's history and culture. Two key organizations currently working to support and advocate for Afro-Mexicans are México Negro AC and the Colectivo de Mujeres Afro-Mexicanas en Movimiento. Both organizations are actively involved in improving visibility, representation, and rights of Afro-Mexicans, as well as combating racism and promoting cultural pride. I'll include their contact information in comments and descriptions where I post this podcast, but for now you can find the Colectivo de Mujeres Afro-Mexicanas en Movimiento, or the Collective of Afro-Mexican Women in Motion, CAMM, at www.afromexicanas.mx, and Mexico Negro AC is at Facebook. So just look up Mexico Negro AC on Facebook, and they also have a YouTube page that you can look up. So what can we take away from Yanga's story today? First, it shows us the powers of resistance, the strength of community, and the importance of fighting for what's right, even in the face of overwhelming odds, and even if it's only temporary. Yanga's defiance wasn't just about breaking free from slavery. It was about creating a new world where freedom and dignity were non-negotiables. But more than that, in this September, Yanga's story reminds us that Afro-Mexican history is also Mexican history. It's a chapter in the larger narrative of resistance and resilience that has helped shape Mexico and Latin America into the vibrant, diverse region it is today. If Yanga's story inspired you, take a moment to share this episode with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't already, make sure to follow and subscribe so you never miss an episode and have access to the over 50 stories we have for you in the vault on the mysteries of Latin America. We've got more great stories coming your way, especially after I'm over this cold. Remember, history isn't just about what happened. It's about the stories we choose to tell about what happened. Let's make sure that Yanga's story and others like it are told and retold until they're part of our shared cultural memory. Friend, my name is Andrew Colon, and I thank you for listening. Adios.